Good evening and welcome. I'm Elizabeth Stage, the director of the Lawrence Hall of Science. So it's my privilege to welcome you to the hall, to the preview of Race, Are We So Different, and to this distinguished faculty panel. We've brought this provocative exhibit to Berkeley because we want to engage the community in issues of contemporary importance where science has something, but by no means everything, to contribute to the conversation. We've appreciated our opportunity to work closely with like-minded colleagues and co-sponsors, including Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion, Gibor Basri, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Harry LeGrande, and Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Equity, Angelica Stacy. And we thank them for their support, as well as you will have an opportunity to return to the exhibit this evening and have a dessert reception, but please return with family and friends to continue these important conversations. We consider this one a beginning for us. To quote a visitor overheard when this exhibit was in another venue, on their cell phone they called from the exhibit and said, "Call everyone you know and tell them to get up here." So with this exhibit, we are very proud to support our Chancellor's Diversity Initiative. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Robert Birgeneau and our dear friend, Mary Catherine Birgeneau.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Good evening and welcome everyone. It's always a pleasure for Mary Catherine and myself to attend events here at the Lawrence Hall of Science and to support the wonderful work done by Elizabeth and all of her staff. Of course, I also want to thank all of you for coming out for this very exciting exhibit on race. Are we so different? I'll correct one thing Elizabeth said. She said controversial exhibit. Actually, as I went around, I didn't see anything controversial at all. I thought it was all just facts, actually. It turned out I had an unanticipated personal pleasure, avuncular pleasure out of the exhibit because in two of them, and I didn't get to see all of them, the prime speaker was one of my former graduate students, who was then Maxine Hammonds, now Evelyn Hammonds, who was an undergraduate at Spelman, did her master's degree in my group at MIT and did some pioneering experiments, but then decided she was more interested in the history of science. So moved to Harvard where she did her PhD. I worked hard to convince her to leave that private recluse in Cambridge, Massachusetts and come out to a people's university. But unfortunately didn't succeed, but now since she's the dean of Harvard College, I guess it wasn't such a bad decision on her part. Research on the history, lived experience, and social structures of race, and how race is being studied and interpreted by the biological and genetic fields are areas of groundbreaking investigation. Our own faculty, students, and researchers are leading some of this research nationally, and you'll be hearing from some of them shortly. The issues that are raised in the race exhibit are very relevant to the future we hope to shape through our research, teaching, and public service. Indeed, parenthetically, in moving here to California, although Toronto was actually not so different, right? I mean, we have a really special opportunity here in California because we're the first, barring, not including Hawaii, state with a large population where there is no majority population. And it's our obligation to prove that that will make our state better as a result of the multiculturalism that we have the privilege of enjoying. Having this exhibit at the Lawrence Hall of Science at this point in Berkeley's history offers our campus a wonderful opportunity for community engagement. And this night, it's only the first community program associated with this exhibit. There will be many more over the next few months with local, middle, and high school students, Berkeley undergrads and graduate students, other faculty, and with staff and their families. I encourage all of you to invite your students, your colleagues, your roommates and classmates, and your families to this exhibit, and I hope that you will engage with them in discussing the issues that the exhibit raises. Of course, again, I want to thank the Lawrence Hall of Science and Director Elizabeth Stage for working to bring this exhibit to Berkeley. This exhibit is a great partner to other work that has taken place on the campus in the areas of equity and inclusion. We have the pleasure of hearing from Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion, Gibor Basri. And both Mayor Catherine and I look forward welcome you this evening, and we look forward to talking to you later. I now turn the evening over to Vice Chancellor Harry LeGrande, who's a co-sponsor for this evening, and for other campus and community events in conjunction with this exhibit. Harry.
Thank you, Chancellor. Well, I just have to say, Elizabeth is 2 for 2 in my book. The first time Elizabeth came to see me, it was like, Harry, there's this big globe thing that I'd like to bring to the Lawrence Hall of Science. And she was explaining it to me, and I said, it sounds like something I'd like to have over my dining room table at home. So this fall, when she came and said, there's this exhibit that I want to bring to the campus, the race exhibit, and what do you think about that? And she started to describe it for me, and I said, it sounds absolutely fabulous. So when she first mentioned to me, I was very excited for the opportunity to actually bring that to the Berkeley campus. Equity and diversity are core campus values, and the one goal to use this race exhibit to kind of further that opportunity in student affairs and for the entire campus. Student affairs and equity and inclusion staff have been pleased to collaborate with Lawrence Hall of Science on this project, particularly in the creation of a 197 student leadership course that ready a more diverse group of undergraduates to facilitate discussions with middle and with high school students who will visit the exhibit over the next few months. And if there's any students that are part of the 197 class that are here, could you stand up so people can see you? Maybe here? I want to thank the 197 class instructors, including Dean of Students Jonathan Poulard, American Cultures Coordinator Victoria Robinson, Multicultural Center Director Lisa Walker, and faculty members Leslie Lusko of Integrative Biology and Ingrid Sayer-Ochi from Education, along with the Lawrence Hall of Science staff. The 197 group took an old-fashioned bus tour for 17 hours. They took an old-fashioned bus tour for 17 hours to Los Angeles to visit this, to get a preview of this exhibit and to kind of begin the training process for that. So I think that was really a badge of courage. And 2 of the students who participated in that will be speaking with us this evening. And at this time, I'd like to bring up Kalie Sacco, a graduating anthropology major, and Fritz Foo, a second-year molecular and cell biology student. Kalie and Fritz.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. Fritz and I are really excited to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all a little bit about the class. So as was mentioned, I am a graduating senior in anthropology this year, and I became really interested in informal education and museum education about 2.5 years ago. I've been involved with the museum education program at the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology. And over the summer, I actually had the opportunity to work at the Lawrence Hall of Science teaching summer camps to kids aged 5 through 12. So that was really exciting. So I already knew that the Lawrence Hall of Science is a great place to be and all the great things that they do. So when I first heard about the course, I knew that it was something I wanted to be a part of. And being an anthropology major, race as a cultural concept is one of the first things that we actually learn about in the intro to anthropology courses. So I felt like I knew a little bit about this material, but when I really started to take the course and talk to other students, and especially when I got to go to LA, I really learned that this is an incredibly large subject, and I feel really fortunate to be part of a group that's going to bring this information to middle schoolers and high schoolers, because race and ethnicity are things that are really integral to forming a person's identity, and I feel like a lot of middle schoolers and high schoolers probably don't get the opportunity to think about it. So again, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity, and enjoy the exhibit tonight. Hopefully you'll come back, bring your kids, bring your friends. I spent 2 hours in LA looking at the exhibit, and that was not enough time. So hopefully you'll return. Thanks again.
Thank you.
You'll have to excuse me tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't get a sip of that Chardonnay, so we'll have to see how this speech goes. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished faculty, alumni, donors, it's wonderful to see so many of you come out tonight in support of this exhibit's opening. I'd first like to begin by rethanking those at the Lawrence Hall of Science for its relentless efforts these past months as they work to bring this display to our university, to a place which so many of us call our second home. It's also on our campus last semester that I found myself enrolled in a seminar designed to teach undergraduates like myself how to be well-versed in the poetry of race. Yes, poetry. Now, I understand many of you out here are in the science fields, and the idea of composing a haiku or writing a sonnet to your high school love is a little bit scary. But allow me to say that discussing race really is an art form. Few people seem to be able to do it well. Those that can appear to do it well have committed their entire lives to studying its subtle nuances. And no matter how much exposure we get to it, hearing race being expressed candidly, objectively, meaningfully, no matter how many times we do it, it's always remarkable and inspiring. In that sense, the seminar provided me an open space of discussion where I could practice my art. Each Tuesday afternoon, huddled into Barrows Hall, I would join students from across campus from all kinds of disciplines: anthropology, ethnic studies, biology, and together we would synthesize what we had learned in classrooms and experienced in our personal lives, with the goal of ultimately being prepared to facilitate discussions for those who would be visiting the exhibit. I would like to encourage you all tonight to really take advantage of what you have before you now. Rarely do we have an opportunity such as the one presented before us to explore race, something both complex and ubiquitous, with the depth, breadth, and objectivity of the exhibit. Some of you may walk out of here completely enthralled by what you've experienced or inspired to act differently in light of what you've learned. For others, you may simply leave with nothing more than a conversation piece to share with your nieces and nephews in the upcoming weeks. And I would say that the variable outcomes of this is not actually a flaw of the exhibit, no. In fact, the spectrum of outcomes is it's actually the result of the nature of the beast of which we deal with. Because as we explore race in these changing times, we come to realize that how we embody it and how it impacts us is both a remarkable and very poignant individual experience. But we also recognize that the collection of individual experiences drives and defines the function of our society. By opening ourselves to the knowledge offered by all fields, whether we talk about forming public policies or understanding how genetics works in our populations, we realize how true that statement rings. Truly, race is a multi-dimensional facet of our lives. Like a cube spinning in the light, we never see all of its faces, at least not from the same perspective. Thus, what matters is that we do attempt to understand it, that we do encourage ourselves and those around us to discuss it from all academic and personal backgrounds. And hopefully this exhibit will provide you all the opportunity to do so tonight. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to listen to Berkeley students. So I want to thank the students who've just spoken and all the other students who participated in the course. And of course, their work's not done. They're going to be doing all the work with the middle and high school students this semester. And we have a lot of other activities going on campus as well. The commitment that they've shown to this is shared by a lot of people on campus, and it's been very exciting for me as the Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion to partner with the Lawrence Hall of Science on this exhibit. I particularly want to take the time now, though, to thank all the staff who have been behind the scenes putting all this whole thing together. And their work is just beginning tonight. As I said, we have a lot of more activities planned for the rest of the semester. So thank you all very much for doing that. It's exciting for me always to partner with the Lawrence Hall of Science. Almost nobody knows that my whole career at Berkeley wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had lunch up here at the hall these many years ago. I'm not going to talk about that story, but of course in the meantime, I've had various collaborations with the hall since I'm an astronomer, and they have a little planetarium here. And I've also worked with folks at the hall who teach science and the pedagogy of science teaching, and they work with Berkeley students here, but those students then also go out into the community. So the hall is very engaged in the community. And bringing this exhibit on race is another real asset that you've brought to the community. Now I have the privilege of introducing our faculty panel speakers tonight. The moderator for this evening is Professor Michael Omi, who's Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies and the co-author of Racial Formation in the United States, which is a groundbreaking work that transforms how we think about the social and historical forces that give race its changing meaning over time and place. He's been a past recipient of UC Berkeley's Distinguished Teaching Award in 2005 and received also the inaugural Distinguished Teaching and Mentor Award from the Asian section of the American Sociological Association. Since 1995, he's been the co-editor of book series on Asian American history and culture with Temple University Press. And from 1999 to 2008, he served as a member and chair of the Daniel Koshland Committee at the San Francisco Foundation. He's also served, it says, token sociologist, I hope that wasn't true, as the sociologist on the project advisory panel for race and human variation for the American Anthropological Association. So actually the result of that board's work is the current museum exhibit that we have here today on race, how are we so different? And I was talking to him ahead of time, and he said, you know, it was very interesting at the beginning when you had a lot of academics on the subject of race getting together and trying to talk about an exhibit and how you would do that with the public. And it took a few years before they really got this together, but I think we'll all agree that they did a good job in the end. Next is Nailah Nasir. She's an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education and the African American Studies Department. Her research centers on how issues of culture and race influence the learning, achievement, and educational trajectories of African American and other non-dominant students in urban schools and community settings. Specifically, she's conducted some studies on the nature of mathematical thinking and learning for African American students outside of school, such as in places like playing basketball or dominoes, formation of racial identity and the interaction of that with mathematics learning, and the nature of connection and disconnection for those students in high school. She's also interested in marginalized students' experiences of teaching and learning in juvenile hall schools. Some of her recent works have been published in the Anthropology and Education Quarterly, the American Educational Research Journal, and the Educational Researcher. Next is Kim TallBear. She is Dakota, a member of the Siston Wahpeton Oyate in South Dakota. She's an assistant professor of science, technology, and environmental policy at Berkeley and is at work on a new book called Native American DNA, Origins, Ethics, and Governance, which is forthcoming. Kim aims to understand how U.S. tribes and other indigenous peoples resist, regulate, and initiate scientific research, and how they use science and technology to govern. This spring, she's teaching a graduate course on indigenous, feminist, and post-colonial approaches to science, technology, and environment. And at the other end of the table, we have Charis Thompson, who's an associate professor of gender and women's studies. She's an expert on the ethics of reproductive technologies and stem cell research. She's the author of many articles on the history of race science, and the role of race in contemporary biomedicine. Her last book, Making Parents, won the 2007 Rachel Carson Award from the Society for Social Studies of Science. She has also received Berkeley's Distinguished Teaching Award in Social Sciences last year. And her latest book is called Good Science. So please welcome me in joining our faculty panelists.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Basri. The concept of race and its biological and social meaning continues to be a very contested issue. In October of 2007, James Watson, who shared the 1962 Nobel Prize for deciphering the double helix of DNA, created quite a stir in an interview with the English press when he stated that he was, quote, inherently gloomy about the prospects for Africa, unquote, because of deficiencies in Black African intelligence, as verified by standardized testing. I recall that Watson gave a speech here in Berkeley in 2000, which suggested a link between skin color and the sex drive, arguing that dark-skinned people have stronger libidos. Quoting Watson, "That's why you have Latin lovers. You've never heard of an English lover. Only an English patient." You know, as a footnote to this, I should mention that a couple of years ago, Decode Genetics of Iceland did an analysis of Dr. Watson's genome and claimed that Watson had 16 times the number of genes considered to be of African origin than the average white European does. Perhaps he has a stronger libido as a consequence. Race, Are We So Different, represents an interrogation of many of these issues raised by Dr. Watson's comments. It explores the science of human variation, the history of race and racism in the United States, and the lived experience of race. As Vice Chancellor Basri noted, I was fortunate to serve on the project advisory board of this exhibit, and yes, I was the sole token sociologist, and I learned a lot. First, I learned that it's really difficult to communicate to a broad audience the idea that while race may not be real in a scientific sense, as a fixed biological category, race is nonetheless a meaningful social category that has real consequences. And we see these in things from the racial classifications in the census, for example. The second thing I learned, as Vice Chancellor Basri alluded to, is that I learned that a group of academics, principally physical and cultural anthropologists, didn't have a clue as to how to translate their ideas into an accessible museum exhibit. And in that respect, this exhibit is really testimony to the expertise of the staff of the Science Museum of Minnesota. They're the ones who took these ideas and designed and fabricated what you have explored this evening, or will hopefully explore this evening. This exhibit on race comes at a very important historical moment. For one thing, there are ominous signs that we are witnessing a reinscription of race as biology. In the field of pharmacogenomics, we have seen the introduction of Bidil, the first ethnic designer drug being marketed by Nitromed to African Americans who suffer from congestive heart failure. Is the recognition of race important for understanding disease susceptibility, genetic susceptibility rather, to certain diseases and receptivity to specific drug treatments? That really does remain a pretty controversial question. In the field of forensics, for those of you who are enamored by numerous CSI television spin-offs, we have molecular biologist Tony Fridakis of DNA print genomics, who came to fame in a Baton Rouge serial killer case in 2003. Fridakis claims that he can determine a murderer's race by analyzing their DNA. Then we have Oprah Winfrey and Henry Louis Gates Jr., among others, who have helped to inspire a growing popular quest by individuals to find their roots through ostensibly scientific means. And a recent article in Science says there are now at least 24 companies that market genetic ancestry tests, and that more than 500,000 people have purchased these tests over the past 6 years. On the political front, the election of Barack Obama as president has really been popularly interpreted and often greeted as the dawning of a new post-racial era in the United States. The fact that a black, or in this case, part black man, the fact that he now occupies the highest post in the land is often regarded as stunning testimony to how far the nation has come in moving beyond the racial barriers of the past. Lost in such a celebratory analysis is the persistence, and in many cases the deepening, of racial stratification, of inequality and difference. Issues such as the growing rates of incarceration, the subprime home mortgage crisis, toxic waste dumping, disinvestment in the public sector, and the war on terror all continue to have explicit racial dimensions. This evening, we really hope to encourage a dialogue about race. First, each of the distinguished faculty on our panel will briefly talk about their ongoing research and how it articulates with the broader themes of this exhibit. Then, we'll open it up for conversation with you, the audience. It's impossible, certainly, to cover all the themes presented in the exhibit, but we can at least highlight significant aspects of what we mean and what we don't mean when we talk about race and human variation. And with that, I'd like to hand things off to Professor Nailah Nasir from African American Studies and the Graduate School of Education. Mr. Nasir.
So good evening. I'm happy to be here. I've been coming to the Lawrence Hall of Science since I was a young child, so it's really an honor to be here as some sort of expert. One of the things that stood out for me in the exhibit was the way that it makes clear that race is, at its core, a political and social categorization intended to serve the purpose of supporting and justifying stratification of resources, right? But it's also alive and fluid and plays a central role in how people make sense of who they are and what their place is in the world. So then we can view race as both fundamentally political and also deeply personal, affecting both access to all kinds of resources, housing, wealth, education, but also affecting our sense of self, our connections with others, our feelings of belonging and efficacy in the world. So my research is focused on just this intersection between the political and resource allocation aspects of race and the personal sense-making aspects of race. I explore these issues in the context of education and schools, and I'm particularly concerned with understanding race, access to learning and high-quality schooling, and identity for African American and other marginalized students. So for tonight, I thought I'd share with you a little bit about one study that I completed recently, which examines how elementary and middle school students understand racial stereotypes about school. And so what I'm going to share with you is a little bit about, and there was a part of the exhibit where they talked to high school students and got their perspectives on race, and it really struck me in that conversation in the exhibit, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to the whole thing, that very rarely did the students articulate this kind of political and social nature of race. For them, it was really about an individual experience and an identity. And so as I talk to you, I'm going to share with you a little bit about what the students that I studied, the sense they made of race and racial stereotypes, and then also hopefully push us to reflect a bit on how that always has this social and political and resource allocation context, but in a way that's often invisible to young people, at least young people of this generation. So in the study that I'm going to talk about, we asked several related questions. First, do elementary and middle school students hold racial stereotypes about who's good at school? Second, for students from groups who are negatively stereotyped, in this case African American and Latino students, were these students more or less aware of these negative stereotypes than other groups? And are they more or less likely to endorse these stereotypes? So we were interested in both, did students know that racial stereotypes exist about who can be good at school, and did they believe them, right? And finally, we were interested in what all of that meant for how students engaged in their schools and classrooms, and what it meant for their sense of themselves as students. So to address these questions, we surveyed a diverse sample of about 150 students. Half of them were in 4th and 5th grade, half in the 7th and 8th grade, because one of the things we were interested in is, in what ways do those things change as kids get older? And in addition to the survey, we chose 12 students to study more closely. And here we focused on specifically African American and Latino students. We conducted a set of interviews which allowed us to capture a richer picture of how they were thinking about these issues. And we also conducted observations of them over the course of 6 months as they participated in their classrooms. So, cut to the chase. Here's what we found, since I only have 5 minutes. And I struggled to take, Michael, I struggled to take all of the data out. So I'm giving you the summary of the data. First of all, most students were very, very much aware of racial stereotypes, that African American and Latino students are not good at school, and Asian and white students are good at school. And this awareness was true across students from all racial groups. Second, the awareness increased as students got older, right? So middle school students were much more likely to be aware of these stereotypes than elementary school students. Third, students who were members of negatively stereotyped groups, right? The African American and the Latino students were more aware of the presence of these racial stereotypes. However, they were also less likely to believe them. This, of course, can leave these students in a bit of a quandary, right? So they're both highly aware that others thought that people like them were not good at school, yet they didn't believe it. It's kind of a lot to manage as a middle school student, right? Processing both the way others are thinking about you and how that is at odds with the way you're thinking about yourself. So in our interviews, We also learned quite a bit about how students were thinking about these stereotypes. We found that some students didn't acknowledge the presence of them at all. Others acknowledged positive stereotypes about whites and Asians, but not negative stereotypes about their own groups. Still, other students were highly aware of both positive and negative stereotypes about race. And when students were aware of such stereotypes, they responded in different ways, right? Some students admitted that they believed them to be true and even cited evidence to support the stereotypical beliefs by pointing to confirming examples of specific students from their schools. This is an important point that I'm going to come back to in a minute. Other students were conflicted about their own beliefs and argued that while in general the stereotypes were true, they themselves were an exception. And still others, these are mostly the older students, were adamant about the falsehood of these stereotypes and felt it was their job to prove them wrong. And students who fell into this latter category tended to be more highly engaged in their classrooms, really committed to school, and to a sense of themselves as students. Findings showed that resisting negative stereotypes about their group was significantly related to academic identity. So that was a lot of information, but I want to say a bit about what I think the take-home message is here. First, because these studies are conducted in California, even in a liberal, diverse state like California, race continues to define students' experiences in schools and is central in how they make sense of their own and their classmates' academic performance. Students were highly aware of the stereotypes that permeate broader society, though they varied, as I said, in their level of critique with respect to these stereotypes. I found it problematic that some students viewed what we would call stereotypes simply as truths about individuals, which they saw as being backed up by their own observations, rather than understanding them as a product of systemic exclusion and oppression. And finally, holding a strong narrative about the falsehood of stereotypes is an important tool for stereotyped students, and one that we can support students in developing. I mean, it's interesting that many of these students said that our conversations with them were one of the only times where they explicitly talked about issues of race in school, right? But clearly these conversations are really important for students to have. And I want to note, finally, that we can't separate the sentiments of these students from the kind of educational system that their experiences are a part of. Right? We tend to look at issues of racial identity as apart from people's lived experiences in the world and the types of resources that we've given them access to. These students attended school districts that routinely track students by race, that hold strong assumptions about the capabilities of students by virtue of race. This means that the differences that students observed and that they articulated, at least in part, were constructed by the policies and practices of schools. So this cycle between limited access to resources and the perpetuation of stereotypes is a vicious one that contributes to the maintenance of inequality in our society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nasir. Next we have Kimberly TallBear, who's a professor of science, technology, and environmental policy. Do you want to come up?
Hi. I just wanted to say really quickly before I start, I love this exhibit. I saw it when it opened up at the Minnesota Science Museum 2 years ago, and two things I noticed when I was there. There were loads of people of color walking through the Minnesota Science Museum. I grew up in part in St. Paul, and that is not the norm. So it was bringing in a very different demographic, and I think that's a wonderful thing for science education. The second thing is I agree with what everybody has said. This exhibit does a fantastic job of communicating some of the best of race scholarship that's out there, but in a way that people can actually understand it, because academics are not good, I think, maybe I'm not good at talking to the public about really complicated stuff around race. So anyway, it's a fantastic exhibit, and I'm really very honored to have been asked to be here tonight. I'm now a huge supporter of science museums. So I'll just talk a little bit about my research. It's situated across the humanities and the social sciences. In particular, I merge two fields, science and technology studies and Native American and Indigenous studies. So I'm concerned with issues of science, technology, culture, and governance. And so what do I mean by that? There are sort of three things that ground my research. First, I became interested in how Native American tribes and other indigenous peoples resist scientific research, projects that they find exploitative. So for example, human genetic diversity research got me into thinking about this stuff. researchers draw indigenous people's blood in order to tell a history of human migrations, that tribes fear will be privileged over their own histories and their own identity claims. So in essence, that scientists will purport to tell them who they really are, not just who they think they are. So that's a touchy issue for cultural reasons, because U.S. tribes and other indigenous peoples are, for cultural and governance reasons, U.S. tribes are always looking for greater authority to be self-governing, in large part because they see themselves as citizens of their tribes or indigenous nations. And genetics, they feel, has no business mediating concepts of citizenship. So concepts of race and citizen come into tension around that type of research. Second, my interests in science and technology stem from having been a tribal planner before I became an academic. So this is my second career. So I'm really very interested in how tribes regulate scientific research, especially how they require certain benefits to be returned to their communities in return for granting access for people to study their lands and resources and even the bodies of their citizens, as geneticists do. So again, that's the tribes as nations motif that draws me into this. I came to study race precisely because as a concept, it so often conflicts, or it should conflict, with concepts of citizenship. So in the US, race is deeply entangled with citizenship, which is a problem, and I'll come back to that. The third set of reasons for my interest in science and technology also stem from having been a planner, and more fundamentally as a person who grew up on a South Dakota reservation in the throes of tribal politics ever since I can remember. So at my core, I support the concept of tribal governance and sovereignty, but I also happen to be really fascinated with the scientific concepts I study, and probably if I wasn't tracked away from science in a racist reservation public school, who knows, I might not be a social scientist. So I've become very curious about how tribes use science and technology to govern, not only how they regulate science and technology in their communities, but how they are actively deploying science and technology to expand their governance capacities. So for example, tribes are using geographic information systems to do cleanup of a World War II bombing site in South Dakota. They're working with engineers and architects to build culturally and environmentally sustainable housing. Berkeley's actually involved in one of these projects with the Mendocino County tribe. I know Native American scientists who are incorporating cultural use criteria into environmental risk assessment. And one tribe has even funded a translational genomics research institute, and so they serve not only as a funder of that institute, but they are actually granting access for researchers to study their citizens. So they're an investor, and then they're research subjects, and they are requiring training of their people in sciences. So tribes are doing very interesting things with science and technology that bring governance, science, and culture all together. So I'll talk about race a little bit more directly for a couple of minutes. A colleague and I just finished writing a paper that I think helps explain my interest in the study of race and how it conflicts with Native American governance, and also how race has been constituted since the 17th century by natural and social scientists in ways that justify the distribution of power and resources in ways that favor whites and disfavor everybody else. So my colleague Jenny Reardon and I, she's in the audience, she teaches at UC Santa Cruz, we just wrote a book, or wrote an article called, what is it called? Genomics, Biological Anthropology, and the Construction of Whiteness as Property. And so it's drawing on Cheryl Harris's seminal Harvard Law Review article. We argue that genetic scientists and the claims that they explicitly or implicitly make to indigenous biological samples and genetic data, they're in effect doing what Cheryl Harris argued in her Law Review article. In addressing affirmative action debates, she described whiteness as having become a treasured property that needs to be protected. Key to that is the right to define the parameters of whiteness, and of course then you have to define the parameters of all other races and the realities then of those other people. So whiteness historically claims the right to control the legal definition of group identity. We look, Jenny and I, what we bring to this is we look at the role of human genetic diversity researchers in this long history of claiming the right to define. So for centuries, European researchers have assumed a right to study non-white others and to define those others, who they are and who they are not. Part of that perceived right includes controlling and defining Native American biological samples, so which bodies are sufficiently indigenous to be sampled and which are not. So in that, we argue that human genetic diversity researchers are actually claiming a property right, not only in indigenous biological samples and data, but they're also claiming the right to define identity. Then you have countervailing claims by Native Americans to a property interest in their own biological materials and their own history. But those protests to this kind of research then get viewed, much as Harris describes white resistance to affirmative action, as an obstruction of the original or current distribution of power, property, and resources that are the result of right and merit. So Native Americans who resist this kind of research view scientists' implied rights to research and their rights to define group status as clearly entangled with histories of colonialism. Native people know this. They see this very clearly about scientists. The scientists who are challenged often imply that rights to research are about the common historical patrimony of all of us, and then also about their rigor and rationality as scientists. You've got very different views going on here. But it's not only a right to define the property interest in biological samples that researchers are claiming. And by the way, we should not limit our understanding of this property interest to DNA and blood samples. This property interest has been claimed for a long time in Native Americans' bones and skulls. And we have thousands of bones and skulls stored at Berkeley right now, so that there's a property interest there being claimed. The entire race category of red has also been appropriated by whites. So we look at redness and whiteness here as racial categories. In the 19th century, there was a very popular anthropological doctrine called the doctrine of cultural evolution, in which Lewis Henry Morgan argued that Native Americans, or Indians at the time, were actually the ancestors, the cultural ancestors of whites. And in the 19th century, in that evolutionary chain of humanity, you had apes and Africans on the bottom. You had Native Americans in the middle, halfway between barbarism and civilization, and you, of course, had whites at the pinnacle. They alone were fully civilized. And so what you had then was this capacity for whiteness to absorb redness into its body, and so this was a very different racialization of Native Americans. One of the things that happened was this sort of willingness and the justification in science, and this also happened in 19th century federal Indian policy, this willingness to absorb redness into the white body politic actually helped shore up the boundary between whiteness and blackness. So it's a very interesting role that Native Americans played in the racialization more broadly in the United States. So that's something that we are looking at, and we're sort of relating to the kinds of claims that people are making in terms of biological samples. So I think I'll stop there. I just got the time. I could go on about this forever. That's just a bit on my research, and I'm actually really looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor TallBear. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Charis Thompson from Gender and Women's Studies. Charis, would you like to speak from there or the podium?
Can everybody hear me okay? So it's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank and congratulate the campus and the museum staff for getting the exhibit. I'm really thrilled about it. And thank you all for coming tonight. And what a wonderful panel to be on. Thank you for that too. Okay, so the exhibit shows us that there is no such thing as the scientific basis of race. And, thank goodness we know that definitively now, and that this beautiful exhibit makes that so very clear. Of course, the exhibit also shows us just how deadly and brutal the association between science and race has been in the past. So that means we should ask right now whether or not it's time to move beyond thinking about science and race together to a space where we think of science as finally as neutral as it was meant all along to be. And what I want to ask you right now is whether or not that's what we should be doing. And I want to answer yes, kinda, but mostly no. And these are the reasons why. So yes, we want to move beyond thinking of science and race together. We want to move beyond, that's a dreadful word, but that the bloody, brutal, and genocidal association between the two. And certainly in the sense where any time we come across in any of our practice as scientists or consuming science in the newspaper, in popular culture, where we see that there's a connection being made with categories of peoplehood, ethnicity, race, nation, your immigrant status, whatever it might be, and some claim about science, that all of our, whatever, alarm bells should start ringing. We should start asking ourselves, is this right? Is this true? On what basis are they coming to these conclusions? Is it because what they're actually measuring is lack of access to resources? Is it because what they're actually measuring is a history of turning people away from studying science disciplines, for example, turning to my colleagues' presentations? So certainly we want to be in a place where whenever we hear those associations, alarm bells go off. But there are also some really, really good reasons why we want to continue to think, despite how dangerous it is to do so, continue to think about science and race together. And I want to just tease apart a couple of these. So one of them is that whenever we think about different kinds of science in our society, especially when we engage in beginning to fund new areas of science, as the state of California has done recently with stem cell research, for example, an area I work in, we want to be incredibly careful that members of every group that's socially salient in the society are well represented as the experts, as the scientists in that field of research. So that's one reason why it's important to think about those things together. Another reason why it's absolutely critical to continue to think about science and race together is that we need to be able to address disparities. And those disparities range from health disparities, which our campus is a leader in, to digital divides, our campus is a leader in that as well, through a range of different kinds of disparities that are not just differences in representation within a given field, but also who has access to the resources, who's likely to be exposed to them at different periods over the life course. But we also need to continue to think about science and race together, because doing so allows us to question common ways of thinking about things, allows us to question framings that we just kind of inherit as part of either the innovation or scientific process itself or part of the political and cultural process itself. So I want to give you one example, again, from my own research, which is on reproductive technology, stem cell research, genomics, and things like that. So to give just one example then, at the same time at which California voters passed a proposition that took taxpayers' money to fund stem cell research, we also passed a proposition that made it legal, that just went into effect in January of this year, that made it legal to take DNA samples from people arrested for felonies, whether or not they were convicted of those felonies. During this very same period of these last few years, we've seen a great expansion of something called personalized medicine, including, and that includes all these things. It does include the genealogy stuff. It also includes the kind of biomedical end of that, which you've probably seen in newspapers referred to as the spitterati, these elite of the sports and entertainment and so on world, then the super rich, who spit into these DNA kits, send them off to 23andMe or some DNA company, and it comes back and it says, guess what, it's highly likely, well in my case, it's highly likely you have freckles. You're probably going to get heart disease. Okay, you may be female. Okay. Right, there's something very serious behind the rise of this so-called personalized medicine, which is when we're forced to think about these things together. So if you're forced to think about Proposition 69, 71, and the spitterati together, in fact, what's happening is that DNA technologies around regenerative medicine and genomics are separating us into different populations who are likely to be being targeted, and we know that there's disproportionate likelihood of some groups to be involved in the criminal justice system rather than others. Groups who are likely to be targeted by the criminal justice system, who are likely to be having DNA being used for those purposes. Now, of course, in the criminal justice system, we're also using DNA for exoneration reasons, but we're using it in this state explicitly for entrapment reasons. Are they the same people that are spitting into these things? Probably not. So we know now, and are they the same people that are likely to benefit from the stem cell research that we're all paying for? Do we have universalized healthcare? No, we don't. So in the very, very best case scenario, we can bring down the prices of, but it's always going to be a matter of the ability to pay, having access to the fruits of that research that all of our taxpayer dollars are going to. So thinking about race and science together can allow us to step back from being so excited about, for example, the idea of personalized medicine, or we're going to tailor to everyone medicine is going to be tailored exactly to everyone's bodies, and realize that we're saying for some people, DNA is going to make sure that you live forever. It's going to be used for regenerative medicine and personalized, so you can be a previver, as they say now, instead of a survivor, and know everything you're going to get down the line and make sure you don't get it. And then for other people, those same things are going to either mean a shortening of your life or at the very least the potential of a life sentence. So immortality, life sentence. We think about the two things together and we realize, well, for example, the University of Berkeley realizes, should we be throwing millions of into studying personalized medicine? No, we should be throwing millions of dollars into studying medicine for every single person and resisting the very framing of the expression personalized medicine. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'd really like to thank the panelists for being so disciplined, too, having me hover over them with respect to policing the time. But what I wanted to do, and what, of course, they want to do as well, is to have a conversation, a dialogue with the audience here. And I believe we have some time to do that. So, and we also have mics, I guess, on the sides. So as you gather your thoughts, I was just thinking of something Professor Thompson was mentioning. I was channel surfing a few weeks ago, and I was watching Latino comedian George Lopez's show, where he had NBA star Charles Barkley spit into a cup to determine his ethnic ancestry. And I remember this very, very sharply. It came back that he was mostly, quote-unquote, sub-Saharan African, but he was also 0% Asian, to which George Lopez says, that explains why you can't play golf. And Barkley was also 14% Native American, to which Lopez commented, that's why you have a gambling problem. So it's interesting how, in fact, these racial stereotypes get encoded into those tests. So in the interest of time and also to have a fuller conversation, I really ask that people try to make their comments, their questions pretty short and succinct, and that would be greatly appreciated. So anybody? In the center there. Might be hard to get you a mic. You got good voice? Sounds good. Oh.
Hi, I'm an anthropologist. I'm Nelson Grayburn, Department of Anthropology in Berkeley. It's interesting, the paradox that you seem to be talking extremely well. However, you're using the category race as though it was unproblematic in using things like who are marginalized students, or they know, or every group. Now, if you went to Berkeley High School, how would you define the races? Would you know what was the fastest growing race at Berkeley High?
Multiracial students. Yes, it's a great point. And there was a whole paragraph that I had to take out for time reasons about that very question, because one of the interesting things about the work that we did in this school was that we first obtained racial, kind of the demographic information on the kids from the teachers, right? Who got it either from school records or kind of by eyeballing the kids and guessing, right? And when we asked the kids the same questions, they actually self-identified in much more complex ways. But they held that at the same time that they knew the category people expected them to be a part of, or that the society defined them to be a part of. And they responded in relation to both. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, they had a sophistication around knowing, well, I'm really this and this and this and this, but if I have to check a box, I check this one, and this is how people view me. So I think you're absolutely right, and we were thinking about writing a paper that actually looks at the differences between the ways the school categorized students and the ways that they categorize themselves. But I think in part it reinforces this idea that way that we have of knowing how other people are looking at us racially is another way that all of this kind of stays active and alive. And to the extent that we can't find a place to complexify is a huge part of the problem, right?
My kids said it was Harper, but only Harper could recognize Harper automatically.
Yes, thank you.
Just a quick question. Will tonight's talk be incorporated into the exhibit?
No.
No.
Could it be?
Well, you know, it is apparently being a podcast, or it will be on iTunes.
Well, we actually made an overflow parking lot in case it didn't rain tonight. But yes, it's going to be uploaded on the University channel of iTunes.
Oh, thank you. More questions, comments? Don't be shy. Yes, just go.
Hi, thank you. This was great. I really enjoyed this. I'm not sure how to put this question, but I'm thinking that the implication of almost everything everybody was talking about in terms of race was that it was whiteness and everything else. And so I'm curious about the issue of biracial, multiracial, how that may change anything that any of you have said. I'm thinking, Dr. TallBear, about your book you did recently about Black Indians. You contributed to a book about that. I'm just thinking about how you named out 4 categories, but I'm thinking about how does any of that change if you're talking about biracial or multiracial individuals?
Kim, do you want
I can respond a little bit. I mean, I think this book on the National Museum of the Native American Indian, I'm too close, right? did a book on Black Indians. And I think partly in response to the controversies with the Seminole freedmen and the Cherokee freedmen, it's very difficult in this country to identify as Native American when you're Black. It's much easier to identify as Native American when you're white. And so that's partly what I talk about, is it's the take-up of red into the white body politic. It's not very easy. It doesn't go the same way for Blacks, right? And so you're questioned much more about that. So it's not necessarily a response to what you're saying, but there are very, very particular politics around being Native American. I mean, I'll give you some data. I actually do study genetic genealogists, and one of the communities that I've studied is a largely self-identified group of white family tree researchers. About 45% of their posts in the several years that I looked at, they're looking for Native American ancestry. There is not a single person in this largely self-identified white group looking for recent African ancestry. They're not looking for slave ancestors. The proclivity for saying I am Native American when you're white and having that be recognized, I mean, that says something, right? So I don't think that quite answers the multiracial question, but I think there are going to be complications around how people can identify multiracially based on the way the black-white binary has been set up historically. So.
Just one quick comment I could make on that, and I think there's a lot of connection between Professor Finney and Professor Graben's questions on mixed race and the complexities of it. I absolutely concur with my colleagues that the historical specificity, as well as the strategic context, is absolutely vital in the level of complexity, and people are, especially people who are marked by racial categories that are subject to negative stereotypes. The sophistication with which people are able to use the categories in different settings is very, very interesting. In my field, for example, in reproductive technology, so just one quick thing that might be of interest, depending on what part of the country you're in, which categories the doctors themselves collect data on varies a lot. So it's pretty black-white in clinics in the South. There's a very prominent Asian American categories, and finally differentiated too. And a lot of elision, and I've written about this, between categories of your national origins, your race, your ethnicity, and in some cases too, your immigrant history and your religion.
It seems to me one of the biggest differences between races is cultural. And these cultural differences, it seems to me, have been very important to the growth of civilization and the different points of view and so on. As we unify, that's wonderful for us to be more and more unified, and as we talk to each other more and more, and we travel back and forth, and we intermarry, that's great. On the other hand, I think the cultural differences, the loss in the cultural differences is a loss. It's too bad, and I think those cultural differences have been very important and have contributed to our civilization generally.
Yeah, perhaps the panelists might want to talk about some of the connections we've made historically between race and culture as well. Yes? All right.
Perhaps that's for you. Yeah, I think that's for you.
That was for me? That's a lot. You know, I really think it might be, rather than go into a long sort of discussion about that, it might be pretty illustrative to look at some of the issues that have been raised in the exhibit itself when you view it, particularly around the history and the ways we've made these easy kinds of connections between groupings defined by different sort of skin color to other anthropomorphic differences that we link to sort of specific cultures. And there has been a pretty vibrant debate recently as to whether or not we're experiencing a form of cultural racism, where in fact people have disavowed explicitly biological notions of race, but still kind of implicitly make claims that to explain, say, social stratification, to understand, for example, different results on test scores, different histories of wealth accumulation, that these are the result of differences in culture. And that has a very long history attached to that as well. Right.
I'd like to thank the panel. This is a phenomenally agreeable conversation. And I also see this sort of paradox between the biological suspicion that categories of race have very little meaning in terms of natural categories at all. And yet you can have racism without race, you can have racialism without race, you can have racial identity without the existence of this clear distinction. My question is nomenclature. Is there any term other than race to capsulize what you're referring to as ancestry that can be accepted biologically as well as culturally? I'm a writer and I'm forever coming up against this problem. I often say you can't put clade in some sort of ordinary story. You can't just refer to ethnicity. What does Hispanic mean? Nothing racial. So is there a word to substitute for race that isn't just sort of political correctness, which would quickly be equated to have the same exact meaning, or is this an imponderable?
So one of the things that they have in the exhibit, they actually say, I wrote it down earlier because Michael also mentioned this, there's a statement about race not being real in a biological sense. Not all scientists agree with that. So, that's one of the debates in the term population. And of course, people will use the term population to try and get away from race, but there are scholars who do a historical treatment of population and show how, in fact, it's not gotten away from race, but it's a reconfiguration of race. It's reconfiguring it in different ways. The genetic ancestry industry, some of the companies use the term biogeographical ancestry to try to get at biological ancestry and the inheritance of genetic markers, and they try to do that in a way that's free of the baggage of race. But it's not free of the baggage of race because the way that they sample is conditioned by race, by social aspects of race. So there is an attempt to try to get away from, to just distill out a biological category. And there are a lot of social scientists and a lot of geneticists who think that is that's not working. They disagree with that endeavor. So it's an active debate.
And I would just add to that for the problem as a writer, what words to use. Two things that, and it was actually suggested by Nailah's comments earlier, that I've often heard people say work well for them. One is to really keep your ear to the ground. How, in fact, are people using words like race and various cognates of it in sophisticated ways in their daily life, and in some way trying to pick up on the sophistication with which people actually change and morph those words and which words they use and how they're loaded in the different settings. And the other is to do justice to the complexity of the context. As a writer, to say if you use a term that is a racialized term, to really go into exactly why that term is being used by whom, in which context. Of course, you know all that, but anyway.
I think I would just add that part of the reason why it's so hard to get away from that as a term is that the race as a construct is very deeply embedded in the history of our country and in our experience with one another. And so I don't know that it's possible to disentangle aspects of it, because it's very deeply embedded in fact, the society that we live in is built upon particular configurations of race and privilege and power. And
I think that's a good part of the exhibit to explore also is about the history of the U.S. Census in this regard. So, for example, over time, there's been the generation of very different kinds of racial categories. Mexican were a racialized category only in the 1930 census, for example. And one of the dilemmas we do have is about what terms make sense or what we're looking for in these kinds of categories of data tracking. You may recall, for example, Newt Gingrich, prior to his fall from grace, was pushing for a multiracial category in the census in order to prove the indeterminacy of all racial groups, why we should get rid of all racial categories. The same was, of course, with former Regent Ward Connolly's initiative, Proposition 54, to get the state of California to abandon any forms of state-based racial classification. Problem is there's a kind of naive conception that if you simply get rid of the categories, that you would get rid of the disparities that the categories are illustrative of.
Hi, I'm Charles Briggs from the Department of Anthropology, and I really would like to thank the Lawrence Hall of Science and also the panelists and the Vice Chancellor for bringing this exhibition here. And probably my most interesting position here is actually being, if you look down the left there in the little tiny print, you'll see the American Anthropological Association, which actually put this exhibition together with a great deal of help. So I'm very pleased that you brought the exhibition here. And my question really is about how you see the exhibition as repositioning anthropology as a discipline with respect to discourses of race. And partly my theory is that this represents a spiral. Franz Boas, who had a fundamental role in founding the discipline of anthropology in the United States, saw anthropology as a public project that was addressing issues of race and colonialism by trying to deconstruct sort of essentialist understandings of race. The problem with that was that he saw anthropology as having the scientific understanding of race that all other people had to be taught to free them from race, which was kind of a contradiction. Anthropologists for a long time thought they could provide the answer about race, which would then set everyone free. Anthropology, it didn't quite work out that way. All right? There were a lot of challenges to anthropological monopolization of discourses about race. Anthropologists whined for decades about being left out, quote unquote, of discourses about race. And this exhibition, I think, is a very significant moment of trying to come back to say anthropology might position itself vis-a-vis debates about race, which clearly anthropology cannot monopolize. So I'm really interested amongst the panelists, how do you read this as a way in which anthropologists and the association try to reposition themselves vis-a-vis public discourses about race? And do you think it works from that point of view?
Maybe a little background to the exhibit itself may be helpful. And you may recall this debate very well, Professor Briggs. Around the time of President Clinton, then President Clinton's initiative on race, there was a significant debate about the kinds of categories which were going to be used on Census 2000. And the American Anthropological Association issued a statement about race, which for the most part made claims that race, we should perhaps abandon the term race because it lacked, you remember this, analytic clarity. Sufficient analytic clarity. That provoked two things. It provoked the American Sociological Association to respond, because I was on that panel, about the importance of race as a social construct, but it also set in motion a group of people within the discipline of anthropology itself to try to rethink what we meant by race. And I think the real intent here was to influence the kind of public discourse about race from a couple of positions. As I alluded to this, and it's very difficult to maintain. On the one hand, you want people to come out of the exhibit problematizing the kind of popular notion that race is something fixed, it's something biological, it's something that is, is marked in human biology. But you don't want people to come out of there then saying, well, that means race doesn't matter. We should get behind it. It supports a kind of prevailing ideology of colorblindness. The best challenge to race and racism is simply to ignore it. And so what was also important to build into the exhibit was the kind of notions of lived experience, the ways in which historically race has been linked to principles of social stratification in the United States, for example. and to make that very clear. But to get across both those kinds of messages is a difficult one, as you can well imagine. But it's one in which I think when the American Anthropological Association took this on, that was the kind of message it wanted to put forth. That's the kind of way it wanted to contribute to a popular understanding of how we might imagine race, how we might imagine what racism is.
I'm Michael Ranney from the School of Education, one of Nailah's colleagues. And I guess I fall into the weird zone where it seems like race is both everything and nothing simultaneously. And I guess from the perspective of the cultural and the identity and the social perspective, if you kind of leave them to the side to the degree that they're extricable at all, and think about the genetic element, again, leaving aside development and, your personal history, we're bundles of nucleotides, right, of DNA nucleotides. We have, I think, roughly like 23,000 genes in the human genome. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. And, one could imagine that some futures, spitterati kind of future, someone will email you from Zimbabwe and say, wow, I just found out looking into the universal database of genomes that besides my second cousins, beyond my second cousins, you're the closest person on the planet to me, in terms of our genetic overlap. And we're kind of talking about a 23,000 dimensional space of race, probably even more so if you consider nonlinear relationships. So isn't it conceivable that race will just go away by itself when we realize how silly we are in our clannishness kind of perspective? I mean, other than beyond these social things, that is, the biological notion will be, it won't be like, well, whether or not, African Americans are best treated by this particular cholesterol-lowering drug. It'll be, if you've got, 4 out of these 7 genes, give us a call because we probably want to change your medication or something like that.
I don't know if I have a good response to that. One of the quotes from the exhibit that struck me when I toured it yesterday was on the genetic section that says, "We are all Africans." So maybe I can respond that if we were all to realize that we are all Africans, how would that change our perspective of ourselves and our position in a kind of global economy, ecology? How would that shift the way we relate to one another, and the way we think about resource allocation and the history of exploitation? I don't know if I'm not addressing what you've raised particularly, but I think there's something interesting about when we talk about the disappearance of race, that it does have this quality of we all have to become white for race to disappear. And so that quote for me kind of flipped that on its head a bit. What if we all became African and then race disappeared?
I can say that when our daughter was applying to college, I suggested she check off African American. I said, we're all from Africa.
But if the we're all African thing too, I didn't talk about this, but it's a big part of a couple of papers I've written. That narrative is invoked all the time in human population genetics, again, to make claims to the right to do research, to have access to people's bodies, to make property claims to their data and their samples. So I'd be really careful about that one too. And anyway, when however many 100,000 years ago, when Lucy was walking around Africa, and Africa is it's a much more loaded concept. It's not just a continent from which all of our genetic ancestors came. It means something very particular in discourses of colonialism. So it's a very big thing to claim, I think.
I think we might have time for just one more question.
Tyler Stovall from the Department of History. Again, I want to thank all the panelists and note that I think the contribution of historians in these debates is usually to emphasize that the idea of race, like the idea of everything else, changes over time. But I also want to suggest here that the idea of race changes over space. In other words, that this is something that has to be understood in globalized perspective. Mm-hmm. That there are many people who've had the experience, for example, of having a racial identity in one place, who when they moved to another country, finding that their racial identity shifted dramatically. And I also want to suggest that The very idea of national identity is also intertwined with race. In fact, in the 19th century, the words nation and race were often used interchangeably in many societies. So race is not just a category that applies to subgroups within a nation, it is also a category that often applies to nations as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Good. Any comments about that?
I mean, I think the great thing, this exhibit's U.S. focused, right? And that was about all that could be done, I think.
Although it does have these panels, for example, about the amazing categories, racialized categories in Brazil, for example. And to do a contrast, you can have this kind of interesting thing where a biological sibling would be racially classified as different from yourself in a very different country than in the United States, which has followed a much more stricter kind of one-drop rule historically with respect to black identity, for example. Okay. On that historian's instructive note, I think we're going to call this to an end and bring back Elizabeth Stage. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming. I hesitate to disagree with the Chancellor, but I actually called the exhibit provocative rather than controversial. And I hope actually to provoke dialogue and disagreement, but not controversy. I think that as Fritz, one of the 197 students, said, we don't talk about this often enough. We don't create spaces where people can have civil discourse. We don't have enough places for civil discourse in this society anyway, but places for civil discourse where people can really think about what they say, what they believe, what they feel, and what role science plays in helping them figure those things out, and what role science really can't touch, because there's history and all sorts of political and social factors going on. So, as I said, I hope this would be one of our first, in terms of the Lawrence Hall of Science, one of our first dialogues with many of you whom I see here, whom I don't recognize. I'm very glad that so many of you came and gave us a chance to participate in your life. And no further ado, I thank the panelists, they're fabulous, and I thank everybody who helped us make this happen, especially those of you who came. More exhibit, more reception, more food, more conversation, and thank you so much.